But hope to have time for questions for Ms. Hegland today, but save them also for a closer, more intimate chat at 4 o'clock, as usual, in the barrel room. Thank you to Jean for being able to sit on here. I have to tell you personally, it is a huge favor to us for Jean Hegland to be with us today. Not only is the acclaimed author of this excellent novel that we've been reading, she's been on the road also promoting a second newer book entitled Still Time. Right? Look for that. But also because Mea Culpa, I had a scheduler mix up, and Jean really went above and beyond the call, which is totally my fault. Really went above and beyond the call to join us and to be with us today. Jean Hegland is an author and teacher. She's a long-time teacher of creative writing here in Sonoma County and elsewhere. And she lives in Sonoma County, in the forest. Is that fair to say? In the forest. And she's a mom. She's a preacher, right? Yeah. Feels faded there. And that's all I really want to say, because I wanted to get to Jean Hegland's talking to us about this wonderful book as soon as possible. Jean Hegland, please give her a huge.
Thanks, Scott. Thanks, Daniel. Thanks, Denny. Thanks, everybody else who is involved in getting me here today. It's always an honor when someone chooses to read one of my books, and it's a peculiar honor when someone chooses to make someone else read one of my books. So I'm I feel very, very honored by that your professors have decided this is a book worth your looking at. And maybe doubly so because this is the second time I've had a chance to talk to this program. So thank you very much. I was able to watch Dr. Miller and Dr. Churchill's lectures on YouTube over the weekend, and so I'm really excited to kind of dive in and join your ongoing conversation about this book. It's my plan to talk for about 35 minutes, and then leave some time for questions and comments, because I'd love to hear what you're thinking. If there's a little extra time, there's a little 3 or 4 minute clip of the director of the Into the Forest film conversing with several of the actors that I thought you might enjoy. But we'll save that if we've got time for it. Let's see. This is just a montage of some of Into the Forest has been translated into 11 languages so far, and it just sold to France and South Korea. So there'll be some more translations that I will have written, but I won't be able to read very well. But before I start talking about the book, I want to detour a little bit and talk about why stories are so important to us, and why it might make sense for your instructors to want you to read fiction in a college course. And I think the answer to that is that stories, more and more and more, we're realizing that stories are the way, the primary way human beings have to make sense of the world and to understand who we are and to understand what other people are and to figure out what's sort of going on. If you think about it, and if you pay attention for the rest of the day, you're going to be bombarded by stories. Every class you go to is going to be telling you stories. When you hang out with your friends tonight, it's going to be just this amazing, montage, collage of stories. We're surrounded by stories all the time. Think about Dr. Miller's story about his own personal going into the forest. Think about Dr. Thompson's story about the marginalizing and exploitative images of Native Americans, from James Fenimore Cooper all the way up to that babe in her bikini and her war bonnet. So it's stories that help us make sense of the world. And more and more people are starting to say that it's story making, story shaping, and story sharing that is what defines us as human beings. So if you think about identity, one of the primary ways we're defined as human beings anymore is the fact that we make stories. Because stories don't exist in the world. It's a structure that we impose on the world. So stories are an essential part of our human identity. And I also think it's the stories that we tell about ourselves and the stories that we seek out in the world that are a crucial part of our own identity. So if you think, if you're considering identity this semester and you think about who you are, I suspect that one of the things that defines you is the stories that you've chosen to tell about yourself, the way you've chosen to kind of shape and understand your experience. Fiction is a really interesting kind of storytelling, isn't it? Because what is fiction but making things up? And what is making things up? Lies. And why is it that lies are so interesting and important to us? Here's our buddy Stephen King saying fiction is a lie and good fiction is the truth inside the lie. And I think that fiction, this intentional fabrication, can function. I mean, first and foremost, it has to engage us, right? If we're not in classes, we're not going to do anything that we don't do because we're hungry for it or we're drawn to it in some way or another. And we're hardwired for stories, so we're just predisposed to want stories. And I think the thing about fiction is one thing it can do once we're entertained and engaged in it is work as a kind of little thought experiment. It's a way of kind of considering a what if about the world. And I think that fiction, it's my thought that fiction invites us to ask sort of three questions or three sets of questions. What's it like? What does it mean? And given those things, what really matters? See how nicely my thoughts dovetail with Dr. Miller's. He's talking about post-apocalyptic fiction and how it's a way of kind of really understanding or thinking about the things that matter most to us. And I would go further and say that's what all fiction helps us do, is it helps us think about the things that matter. For example, Harry Potter, right? Because that's the example that hopefully many of you know. What's it like to be an orphaned, unliked kid and then discover you've got magic powers? You know, what's that like? And then, given what it's like, what does it mean for some people to be marginalized because of their perceived differences? Harry at first is marginalized because he's an orphan, and then later he's marginalized because he's a half-blood. And what does it mean for that to happen? And then finally, given that fine people like Harry Potter can be oppressed or overlooked because they're not in the right group, how should we behave? What should we value? What should we devote ourselves to changing or defending? And I think that fiction is really good at giving us glimpses inside other people's lives, helping us think about what it might mean for things in other lives to be the way they are. And finally, helping us ask the biggest, most enduring questions of all, which is, what really matters? I think what we decide about what matters to us has everything to do with who we are and our identity. What matters, how we behave, and the stories that we tell about ourselves and are drawn to. I think those are wonderful definitions or sort of starting points in helping us define who we are. Once upon a time, about 25 years ago, I couldn't sleep. And I had two little bitsy kids at the time, two little daughters. One was a baby still in our bed. And I knew if I got up, the baby would wake up. And if the baby woke up, her big sister would wake up. And if her big sister woke up, then my husband would be awake. And this would not be a good thing at 3 in the morning. So I thought, well, I'll just pass the time and tell myself a story. And by the time the sun came up, I I had told myself a story that really interested me, that was very compelling. And I thought, I just finished a book of nonfiction. I'd never thought that I would be a novelist. But I thought because I knew how I wanted this story to end, I could just dash it off. Um, and it's really lucky I thought that, because it took me a long, long time to write it. But that story that became Into the Forest turned out to be sort of a lucky convergence of the questions that I was thinking about at that point in my life. You know, we all go through life with just this sort of bag of questions, right? What am I going to have for dinner? What's the meaning of life? And everything in between. And at that point in my life, one thing I was very interested in was forests. Let's see, let me get ahead. This is a scene from the top of the land that I've lived on for the last quarter of a century. But this is where I was born and raised, in eastern Washington. And I had recently moved to this other land, this forest west of Healdsburg, with my, oh, thank you, with my family. Yeah, it's prettier like that, isn't it? I mean, it's a beautiful, beautiful place. But you can see how somebody moving from that to this might be a little bit disconcerted, because there were nothing that you would, remotely call a forest where I grew up. This is what it looked like on the drive home. And suddenly, this is my drive home. And so I was very sort of fascinated by forests and what they were all about. And so that was one of the kind of questions on my mind, between what am I going to have for dinner and what's the meaning of life. Another thing I was fascinated about at that time was sisters. So this is my family. That's me and my brothers. And, they're all old and gray and grizzled now, but they're still just, aren't they great people? You can just look at those guys and know they're cool. But I had these two little baby girls who were sisters, and they were the first sisters in 4 generations. I didn't have a sister. My mother didn't have a sister. Her mother didn't have a sister. So the whole notion, and I love these guys, but boy, I wanted a sister. It's a lot of boy energy. And so I was fascinated by the whole notion of sisters and sisterhood, and the potential of that kind of relationship, and the boundaries and the borders and what all that might mean. And another thing that was really on my mind at that time was the future. And it was clear to me, even back then, that we couldn't, if you crunched the numbers, there was no way we could keep doing this, consuming like this, and stay happily and sustainably on this planet. It was obvious that we could not continue to support a Western lifestyle with using just one planet. The planet that we have is big and benevolent, and it's been very forgiving, but there's 3 billion of us and counting. And even back then, it seemed clear that things were precarious, that it wasn't going to go along forever. So I got the idea for writing this story. I knew how I wanted it to end, and I thought it would take me 6 months to write. I'm glad I'm glad I thought that, because it took over 5 years. I needed to learn who these characters were and what mattered to them and what they needed and what they were afraid of. I need to figure out why they were in the mess they were in, what might get them out of that mess, and what they might get out of getting out of that mess. I had to research everything from ballet to butchering hogs, and an enormous amount of stuff in between. And I had to shape it into a story that would not only be interesting to me, but also to other people. This is some of the boxes, the hard copies of drafts that it took. And there's a copy of the British edition of Into the Forest on the top. So by the way, I'm a huge believer in revision. I can use this term because it's a technical term for writers. I write shitty first drafts. really shitty first drafts. I mean, incomprehensible. I put words on the page so that it's like making clay, so that I can start interacting with them and shaping and thinking. And I wrote a whole book's worth of scenes that didn't make it into the final draft. And so I'm a huge, huge believer in revision. This is the motto that I have above my desk from, well, anybody know this beautiful little, it's a children's book. And at one point one of the kids tells the father, with courage and patience, you can fix anything. And that's my motto as a writer. Oh, wait, I guess I did, okay. Anyway, so that's a little bit of the story of how I got the idea and how I wrote it. And now I want to sort of talk about what I learned. And in one way, I didn't learn anything very new. I was reminded very profoundly of some things that I probably should have known already. I love this quote from my favorite short story of all times, which reminds us that the tale of how we suffer, how we are delighted, how we may triumph is never new, but it must always be heard. There isn't any other tale to tell. It's the only light we've got in all this darkness. And I think it's that reminder that we've got to keep it new. We've got to keep rediscovering these things and telling each other these things. Because as human beings, we're so good at being habituated, right? We can just get used to being madly in love and living incredibly privileged lives. So we need to be reminded of a lot of stuff. So one of the first things I learned about was the place that I live. This is another photograph of the place I live. And I gained a great sense of belonging to this place. I learned how to love this place. I learned how to pay attention to the weather and the animal and the plants. I learned what poison oak looks like. I don't know if any of you have ever seen these watershed literacy quizzes, which invite you to kind of think about or kind of take stock of what it is you know about the place you're living. And I think it's a very, very important tool to use to kind of take stock of what it is you know and what it is you might still want to learn about the place you're living. Because I think that it's really important to be reminded, as Gary Snyder reminds us here, nature is not a place to visit, it's home. I went to see the world premiere of the film adaptation of Into the Forest a couple weeks ago in Toronto. And at the Toronto Film Festival, I was also able to attend the premiere of Naomi Klein's adaptation of her book, This Changes Everything, about the causes and consequences of global warming. And one thing she says in that movie is, if you plan on staying in a place forever, she asks, how does that change your point of view? And The Martian was also premiering at the Toronto Film Festival. And despite The Martian, and despite the kind of thrilling news that NASA has just announced that there is flowing water on Mars, we're staying here. We're staying here. I mean, maybe a few guys are going to go off. But this is our planet. This is our home. And if we really understand that, how will that change our point of view? How will that change our identity and the way that we want to be in the world? Another thing I was reminded of is how utterly unusual this moment in history is. 90,000 years ago, modern human beings, evolutionarily speaking, modern human beings, were living in small bands or tribes with very few material possessions. They were foragers, hunters, scavengers, gatherers, and they lived quite successfully for tens of thousands of years. Only 12,000 years ago, we saw the advent of agriculture. The Industrial Revolution was just over 200 years ago. Consumer societies are, my mother was born in a world that did not contain consumer societies. So this is an enormously brief little flicker in world history. And I was reminded of that pretty profoundly as I was writing this book. I was also reminded of the indigenous Californians and the people who had lived on the piece of property that I was living on before me. By the way, I was so glad that Dr. Churchill was able to speak to you. I watched her lecture on YouTube with great interest over the weekend, and really appreciated her reminder about the misrepresentations and misappropriations of images of Native Americans. I do want to say it was never my intent to add to those images, or to appropriate Native American culture, or to suggest that Nell was playing Indian as a grown-up. It seemed crucial to me to find some way to acknowledge in this book that there were people who had occupied the land that Nell was on very successfully for a long, long time before settlers destroyed so much of the land and their culture. I wanted Nell to discover what I had never been taught in school, that she and Eva weren't the first people to be profoundly connected with that piece of land. And I wanted her to have to confront at least a little of how brutally those first people had been wronged. And I also imagined that it would be inevitable that she would have been inspired by learning about those people who lived full, rich, meaningful lives without Walmart or Harvard. But whoever we are, or wherever we live, or however we live, I was also reminded that all human beings are connected inextricably to the natural world. There's nothing that doesn't come from it. Everything, we're not separate from it. Everything we are, everything we own, everything we consume, everything in this room, our phones, our clothes, everything comes from nature. And it's easy to forget that. It's easy for us to be so removed behind our doors and our walls and, you know, on our screens that we forget that we forget about the natural world that is really the cause of all of this. Naomi Klein, in her movie, said we have to stop pretending we can control nature and start acting like we are nature. And, you know, I'd invite you to imagine the shift in our identity if we do that. The final thing that I learned, or that I'll mention that I learned, is a little bit more about what matters most, at least to me. And these are some quotes that I pulled out of the book that you may recognize, that resonate very profoundly with me. There'll probably be others that work for you. It was hard to find a publisher for this book back in the mid-90s when it was first published. People said, it's not science fiction, but it's set in the future. We have no idea what that is. They said it's a really dark book, but it's about teenagers. There's no way we can do that. Kind of ironic given everything that's happened next. But finally, a small nonprofit press called Calyx Publishing, a feminist press devoted to a longtime champion of women's and minorities' rights, picked it up. And by the way, this is the only cover of the book I have ever bonded with. I think that's a beautiful cover for the book. The cover that is it Random House has out now is just, I fought like crazy, and I'm just the author, so I lost that battle. But God, it's ugly. Anyway, well, it's not ugly. They're very pretty chins, right? Those two ladies have very pretty chins, but it doesn't have, you know, come on, it's the wrong story. Anyway, since Into the Forest was published in '96, it's been interesting to kind of watch the world unfold, watch my thoughts evolve. Everything, you know, from Y2K to the Valley Fire kind of sometimes resonates and makes me kind of revisit this story and think about it. There have been a number of new terms that have come into sort of popular vocabulary that I think that I wasn't aware of at the time, and I probably should have been. And one is a carbon footprint, which is a fairly new concept. This concept that some of us are using more than our share of the world's resources and consequently producing more than our share of, or adding more than our share to global climate change. And this is a chart that reminds us that US consumers are going through planets at an appalling rate. Overconsumption led directly to another concept that scientists were aware of back when I was writing this book, but had yet to really sort of bleed into the popular consciousness. And that is the whole notion of global climate change, of global warming. And I think it's probably the only thing that I really, in retrospect, I wish I had taken into more account as I was writing. Though, boy, that would have been a whole nother book. Global warming is what Bill McKibbins calls the first truly planetary challenge we've ever had. It's the first challenge that the whole planet is facing together. And it's the ultimate game changer. As Naomi Klein says, this changes everything. It's the home wrecker. And it is not a belief system. It's not rocket science. As Paul Gilding says here, it's high school science. If you cut down more trees than you grow, you run out of trees. If you put additional nitrogen into a water system, you change the type and quality of the life you can support. If you thicken the Earth's CO2 blanket, the Earth gets warmer. If you do all these things and many more at once, you change the way the whole system of planet Earth behaves, with social, economic, and life support impacts. This is not speculation. This is high school science. So I think that it's more and more clear that we've been buying the end of the Earth and buying the containers to throw it away in. Naomi Klein says growth is the closest thing we have to a global deity. And I think that by that she means it's what most people on the planet believe in and believe that we have to serve. But Tim Jackson has wrote a really important book called Prosperity Without Growth. And he reminds us, the myth of growth has failed us. And that what we're really looking at right now is what James Kunstler calls the long emergency, Paul Gilding calls the great disruption, Richard Heinberg calls the end of the party. This is another quote from Tim Jackson's book, which I think is so important because it's so hopeful. And this is the sad side of it. Affluence breeds and indeed relies on the continual production and consumption of consumer novelty. But novelty seeds social anxiety, weakens our ability to protect long-term goals, and undermines our well-being. And here is an example of novelty. You did not know you needed Oreo Blizzard cream cookies until you were told about them. This is not something that you woke up this morning needing. You didn't hunger for it like you hungered for food and connection with other people and meaningful work and happy times or whatever it is. You didn't know you needed Oreo Blizzard cookies. And if you think about it, Blizzard is Oreo cookies, right? I mean, it's like Soylent Green or something. You've got, a Blizzard is a kind of milkshake made of crunched up Oreo cookies, am I right? Okay, and so here is crunched up Oreo cookies flavoring Oreo cookies. You didn't know you needed that, right? So I think this is a good example of kind of the links that we have to go to drive growth in consumer societies. And a good example of the stuff that you probably really don't need. There are probably things that you need more than that. Here's the next paragraph. So there's this really glum paragraph, right? Man, this sucks. And then here's the next paragraph in Jackson's book. At the end of the day, prosperity goes beyond fleeting material pleasures. It transcends material concerns. It resides in the quality of our lives, the health and happiness of our families. It is present in the strength of our relationship and our trust in the community. It is evidenced by our satisfaction at work and our sense of shared meaning and purpose. It hangs on our potential to participate fully in the life of society. Prosperity consists in our ability to flourish as human beings within the ecological system limits of a finite planet. And I agree with that. I mean, that's what real prosperity is, right? And I think that's a thing that is very meaningful in the context of my relationship to Into the Forest, and hopefully in the context of your examinations of identity. After Into the Forest was published in the intervening years, there have been a number of terms that have, to sort of counteract global footprint and global warming. And there's a number of concepts that I think give us a great deal of hope. And one is this notion of sustainability, that any system, a farm, a kitchen blender, government, is sustainable if it can continue functioning over a long period of time. And in the hall out there, I saw that Sonoma State University is having a Sustainability Day on October 21st. So it's in the air, this kind of understanding of the need and the foreign value of sustainability. There's also this notion of voluntary simplicity. Many people are cutting back. They're giving up the Oreo Blizzard cookies and finding all kinds of value in many different ways from their voluntary simplicity. There's also this notion of resilience, that human beings have a great ability to recover from misfortune, particularly if we prepare for it and practice for it and kind of have our goals and our identities clear. And this notion of transition. There's a vibrant grassroots transition movement that seeks to build community resistance so that we can move from sort of one crisis to the next without succumbing. Managed degrowth, which is a concept that Naomi Klein talks about, and this notion that I think is so important of prosperity without growth. How can we prosper without this continued growth? Some people are troubled by the end of Into the Forest, but I find it really hopeful. This story isn't a recipe. It's not telling you what you're supposed to do. It's a metaphor. And I think that it's a metaphor that is very suggestive of how we need to recalibrate our values and our expectations. It's not going to work as a solution for humanity to go back to the forest, but I think it will work as a way for each of us to sort of think about what makes us prosper, what makes us grow. And I think that brings us back to that third question that I began by sort of discussing when I said fiction does a good job of asking us or helping us kind of ask what really matters. Given what matters, who are we and what do we want to become? Because I think a great deal of our identity also has to do with where we think we're heading and what we want to be. It's not just who are we right now, but what do we want to move toward? How do we want to evolve? And I think that that's a sort of a part of our identity that's really worth considering and embracing. For me, the things that give my life meaning are education, art, meaningful work, connections with the natural world, with other people, and with the holy world. And so I guess I would just end here by inviting each of you to think about, where would you find prosperity without this sort of endless consumption and growth? I did it. I did it on time. That is all I intended to say. And so thank you for listening so quietly and intently. I really appreciate that. And if you have questions, I would love to answer them. If you don't have questions, I can show you this little clip from the movie. But your questions are way more important, you know, than.
What's happening here is they're pulling together questions that people have written on 3x5 cards. Why don't we watch the video? I'm kind of curious about that while they collect. While some of the rest of you go ahead and write questions if you want.
Okay. It should load up here. Do you guys want to sort through questions? Okay.
Maybe it'll come up.
Maybe.
There's some questions. We'll go right to them.
Okay. Yeah. This is all embedded, but it's not getting out of bed. So we'll listen to some questions.
Okay, so the first question is, do you find a little piece of yourself in both Nell and Eva?
Oh, that's a great question. Do I find a little piece of myself in both Nell and Eva? And the answer is yes. I find a little piece of myself in everybody that I write, in the father and the mother and the crazy guy at Costco. I mean, it's all me. And it's not really, but I definitely have both of those sides to me. Except I would confess that when I was in 6th grade, my ballet teacher told me I needed to find something else to do. So I'm maybe a little more Nell than Eva.
All right, the next question is it worth it to have hope for our planet if many people won't accept that our planet is in danger?
Yeah, that's a very courageous question. Is it worth it to have hope for our planet if so many people won't accept that our planet is in danger? And that's just right at the heart of the matter, isn't it? And I think the answer is a resounding yes. Yes, it's worth it. Yes, it's worth it. And I think it was Howard Zinn who was speaking once, who's was asked a similar question in relation to hope for America and hope for the future, since so many people are marginalized and the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer, and is it worth it to have hope? And he said, yes, of course. And it's also, you know, what are you going to do? Are you going to despair? No. You want to hope, and you want to work, and you want to keep on enjoying your life. Okay? Because that's, you know, aren't we lucky to have these prosperous lives? And we want to keep on enjoying the riches in them. And of course we need to hope. And I think the hope will pay off. It's a grim time, and I know that listening to people like me makes it grimmer. But I think that paying attention to what's wrong is a way of helping us learn how to hope and work for what's right. So thanks for that good question. Good, bravo. And another really brave question. Good, I'm so glad we got to that one. I'll tell you my thinking, and it'll be interesting to see if it jives with some of yours. It was my thinking at that point in the novel, these two young women, teenagers, have lost everything. They've lost everything. They've lost their ambitions, their hope for the future, their family, any kind of community. Eva's been raped, and they have absolutely no hope left. They're in a kind of extremity that I don't think we can even almost imagine. And it seemed to me that at that moment, it was crucial that they find a way to reconnect with that sort of just essential, visceral joy in living. And that sort of just physical body joy of being a body on this planet. They didn't have counselors to go to. They didn't have other people to support them. They were just, in this utter extremity. And so I imagine that in that moment of desperation, they found a moment of profound joy. It was really important to me that it be made clear in the book that it was a sexual moment, but not a sexual relationship that they had. Some of you picked up maybe on this moment that Nell later on talks about how they hold hands before they've just taken automatic, sort of spontaneously to holding hands before they eat. And she says that's the only time we touch. And so, I'm hoping to sort of build in that it's not this ongoing thing. I also think it's really important. Not long after the book was published, I was being interviewed by a journalist who said, "So I understand this book is about homosexual incest." And I literally, for a moment, thought she was talking about a different book. I thought she'd mixed up the books. And I think the homosexuality of it doesn't bother me in the least. In fact, I think we need more and more images in popular culture of homosexual love. Incest bothers me a great deal, and I think the reason is that typically, almost always, 99.9% of the time, incest implies a relationship of brutal inequality, where someone who is charged for taking care of someone else is instead exploiting them in the most awful ways. So someone who's very, very vulnerable is exploited by exactly the person who should be caring for them. And that's deeply troubling. I do not see that in this relationship. I see that moment as a healing relationship between two equals. So that's my take on it. It'll be interesting to see what other people think. Thanks. Is that good? Good enough? Okay. Okay, good. No, no. I mean, no, because the whole story kind of led to that ending. If I were writing Into the Forest right now, I'd be writing a different story, and it would have a different ending. And I think the thing that the ending of Into the Forest sort of suggests but doesn't really account for is a larger community. Because we have to live in the forest, right? Both literally and metaphorically in some ways. We're connected to the natural world, but we're also human beings. And so we have profound connections with other people, and I think that's sort of where the next, that would be the next story. Yeah. Yeah. Why did I include that rape? Yeah, which is a horrible moment. And I have to say, at the premiere of the movie, I sat next to Evan Rachel Wood, who played Eva. And so we're sitting there watching the movie side by side, and the rape scene, which isn't actually seen in the book, but they chose to make it a scene in the movie. And we both knew it was coming. And she started getting tense. I was holding her hand, and we were weeping during that scene. And I was thinking, what the hell were you doing writing that awful scene that made this lovely woman suffer so much? I mean, it was this very, very odd moment. But I think that, well, I mean, I don't know what I was doing, but I'll tell you what it did. You know, I'll tell you what I think it did. I think that it was one more experience that drove the sisters into the forest, right? Because all of a sudden the world out there is even more threatening than the place that they are. It helped them realize that there was a kind of safety and sustenance in the forest. It also was one more step towards that that sort of, you know, breaking down of everything so you could build up everything. And it was also sort of one more barrier broken down so that the two sisters really had to find, you know, even stronger ways to be together. So I think those are some of the things it accomplished. So.
Why don't you share us a little something if you want to about the book and also anything else that we should know about the movie?
Oh, this is my ad. Sorry. Speaking of consumer societies, no, this is my newest book, which just came out this month. It's called Still Time. And it is about a Shakespearean scholar with Alzheimer's. How's that? I get credit for never having written the same book twice. Um, and, um, and except I think they're all books that contain a good deal of hard-won hope. And so he has a daughter who wants to be a game designer. And he hasn't been in touch with her for 10 years. They had one of those miscommunications where it's both of their fault and nobody's to blame. And they haven't spoken in 10 years, during which he's developed Alzheimer's. And the thing about Alzheimer's is if you often, the things we remember longest are either early experiences or the things we've learned by heart. So what happens if you know Shakespeare by heart? Yeah, and so if that's the last lens that you have for making sense of the world is kind of the question there. And will he and Miranda be able to reconnect while there's still time? So, yeah, sorry, where's my ad? The movie, I don't know. I'm really disappointed that this thing I embedded so beautifully isn't showing up. But if you have any interest, if you Google around online, there's little YouTube clips. And I think that the reason that I wanted to share this one with you is I thought that the director particularly does a lovely job of kind of describing her sense of the story. And she says, I wonder if I can find what she says here that I thought was particularly cool. I guess not. But she talks about how we're also worried about our careers and you know, and the world is changing so rapidly, and here we are all worried about our careers. I would invite you to consider the incredible ironies of flying back to the world premiere of Into the Forest in Toronto. And, you know, talk about a collision of cultures and meanings and values there. But I guess that's another thing that makes us human, right, is the fact that we're always kind of entangled in ambiguities.
That's it. Big thanks.